Hello and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Nasty. Today's video is going to be the last part of this mini-series where I dive deep into the current changes that I've made on my base to scale up to 2.5 million effective science per minute, running research productivity. So, there's been some confusions in some of the comments of the videos about, like, well, you released a video in the past where you had a 4 million science per minute video, like a base here, right? So why are you running now at a slower speed of 2.6 million, right, or 2.5 million, right? Why have you scaled down? I haven't scaled down. Research productivity is a 120-second research. So all the other researches, mining productivity, steel prod, lasers, all those things are all 60-second research. So that means that your consumption rate is twice the speed. I think the current meta and the way that people are going to design bases is you're always going to be kind of targeting for double the speed or like rather at, like in this case here, when you wind up running science research, you're going to be running at, in this case, 5 million for all the other sciences, which is currently with the speed that we can research, and then you'll run at half that speed when you're running research productivity. And so that means that the main reason for that is the logistics nightmare that exists from having the actual labs that you're going to wind up running. If I wound up saying that I'm going to run fully 5 million across everything, then I'm going to need double the labs and they're never going to be used for half the time. And so the way that I wind up going and doing this is that I very carefully, as I showed in the last video, I've talked about how I wind up going and turning off certain parts of the base when I'm only running research productivity. So instead of doubling the labs, I just keep the same fixed number of labs, and I just allow the speed of that particular research to dictate how fast everything else produces. So that's the main thing to get that out of the way in the first part. So what are we going to talk about in this video? Talk about Promethium Science. We're going to go and do a deep dive on how I'm currently producing it, and then we're going to go and talk about the complete overhaul of Aquillo. So let's get into the video. So here, what you're seeing now is the old Aquillo setup. One of the things you're going to notice is there's a lot of bots just flying around. It's not incredibly high in terms of the bot usage, but as this particular ship finally comes over to Aquillo, you're going to see that it is actually quite a large amount. Specifically when we actually wind up launching all of these rockets to actually deliver the cryogenic science. So the reason why I wanted to get rid of it is because they cost here on Aquillo, they 5 times the amount of energy consumption. So 5 times the amount of energy consumption means 5 times less distance traveled, which means 5 times more for UPS costs, because you need more bots and more charging time per bot that you're actually flying around. So in general, belting things is better. One of the things you're going to see here, especially once the ship gets here, is that we are actually requesting via bots the individual rocket parts that we need to launch all of these the actual science up to the ship. So the reason why that's a big deal is because whenever you wind up actually going and coming over here to Aquillo, we're going to see this nice launching sequence here where they all like take off at the same time. But the problem is what happens immediately afterwards. So we'll watch these all launch. And then all of these requester chests are all of a sudden at once going to say, hey, we need parts to go and build the next rocket. And so you're going to see a huge wave of all of these bots flying all over the place to deliver those parts, and then now all of those have to charge. And this happens every single time we launch another rocket. So there's these UPS waves of like lower UPS that we wind up having when these basically every single time we actually are launching rockets. And along with also we have these little bot usage, and then we'll see them all fly around, that are delivering right now the holmium plates. It's not a big deal. It's not like it's really high consumption rate right now, but ideally I'd like to have that belted if I could. So that's one big change that I want to make, is not relying on bots almost at all for, especially for the science production, because we're basically there. We just need to route them a little bit differently. And then also I want to get rid of a lot of just extra bloat that I wind up having here. So let's talk about that here next. So I had it originally created a very large setup for producing lithium plates so that we could launch them into space. And the reason for that was I had this spaceship here, which is this foundation station that would wind up going and requesting all of the individual parts from all the different planets, and then would craft directly here on the ship the actual foundations, and then would drop them to either Fulgora or Vulcanus wherever needed them. I have way more than I will ever need, so I want to decommission this ship completely. And that, because I'm decommissioning it, means that I can remove all of these very excessive and elaborate setups for launching fluoroketone, however you wind up saying it, up into space. And I have this huge area just dedicated to platform building. So I want to completely get rid of this and delete it. The next thing that I want to do is kind of like completely redesign the way that I'm doing quantum processors. So I had kind of a notion of doing this where I started like thinking about it, and you can start seeing it here, where I started putting cars in line, because the nice thing about cars is they can sit over heat pipes and actually don't require any heat at all. So they allow you to do some really nice things with designs that you would typically normally have to use red inserters for. And red inserters are really not optimal because they only can transport 4 items at a time compared to a stack inserter. And they also wind up having overall, they're going to have a longer swing time than the other ones. You can see here, this is 2160 per second versus 1080. So they, in order to transport the same amount of stuff, they are going to be active already 4 times as much, but then actually 8 times because of the slower swing speed, right? So these are like, you can kind of think about it as like 8 times more expensive than this nice stack inserter here. So ideally, if we can completely use stack inserters and eliminate all of these red inserters, that would be a huge increase in terms of like what we actually are producing here. So there's a really cool design that I will talk about in a second that I collaborated with a couple people on my Discord on, so to make better. And we'll talk about how we completely eliminated the red inserters altogether with using stack inserters and cars. So the thing here is that you want to minimize the amount of time that's spread over Aquillo. So even though I'm only producing here, like, let's say 40 per second, I am stacking a huge amount in these rocket silos here, so I can do one launch effectively and get all of them out to the actual ship that's coming over. That's a lot of inserters that I wind up using for this. So if you look at this here, that's about 184 inserters and then double that. So for both these different sides, for launching all of those Promethium up into space, which we'll see here take off. I could not have timed that better. So see then now what happens is the production starts here and very slowly starts to fill this belt, and this priority-wise is going to fill up these first silos first. Then it will go down to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So very slowly over time, it will fill up the buffers here so that we can do one very quick, large launch at once. But you also see the problem with the bots. The bots are flying around all over the place to deliver those rocket parts. Again, want to eliminate bot usage as much as possible, and you're just seeing them flying all over the place to deliver all kinds of things like rocket fuel to all the different heating components, and just, again, we have too much bot usage and want to eliminate that. So those are the two things that we're going to talk about for Aquillo, is completely redesigning quantum processors, and also a pretty massive change that I made to the actual blades here that has actually made a net 30% improvement in terms of UPS for this particular setup here. So here's the old base, and let's go and talk through the new one. So here's the new Aquillo base. You notice a lot of things have shuffled around. One of the big key differences is that right now I have worker robots turned on, and you can see them traveling around the base. There's almost not a single bot flying around anywhere. There's the occasional 1 or 2 that you wind up actually seeing. In terms of just how much bot usage has been eliminated here, we can pretty easily see that by the Roboport energy consumption. If you're looking at the last 1,000 hours or so, you can see this where we were using 150 megawatts constantly of the Roboports. And with a lot of the changes that we've made over time, we have dropped this down to 15 megawatts of Roboport usage. Other than this point where I was completely rebuilding Aquillo stuff. So you can see here that like this is kind of reflective of how much bot usage has been eliminated, right? Because if you go from 150 down to 15, that's a 10x reduction in terms of the actual bot usage here on Aquillo. Still have a couple places where they wind up getting delivered, and that's mainly for producing some of the legendary parts and a couple different items that I'm still delivering around the base, like the actual fuel that I wind up using for fusion power cells, but that's like kind of very, very minimal in terms of when they need to be used. But you can see here now, we have completely redesigned the Aquillo base here, or the actual science production, and it is completely botless now. One core difference that I've made, and this is from going back and forth with Geist on my my Discord server, and also with Flux. So Flux recently released a video that was a complete redesign on the way that he was making Q2 science, and it made me kind of rethink a lot of things. So one thing that I wound up doing is I wound up saying, okay, I need to completely eliminate bot usage, so that's why we have now rocket parts that are being interwoven with this cursed weaving here. But that delivers both the fuel for the actual heating towers, but also then brings the rocket parts in for the rocket silos. So, and I've also kind of wound up saying, and I wanted to challenge the idea of, instead of like straight up recycling directly the actual ice, I wind up now actually producing ice platforms. The big benefit to this is that, one, what we saw on Novice with straight up recycling stone is that if you first craft it into landfill, it's like a 30% improvement in terms of UPS. So the idea was like, let's kind of try to take that same concept here, and we'll wind up crafting instead ice platforms. So with that design, the benefit of crafting ice platforms when you're trying to upcycle and create Q2 ice is that when you're dumping this in here, can hold a pretty large buffer of items, and then going and recycling the actual ice platforms is like a very small amount of things that are actually ever going through the recycler. So this still winds up going and destroying the other higher quality items, but they're very, very infrequent that they actually need to come into these cars. And the cars can wind up just going in, there's a clock that winds up just turning occasionally that is controlled all the way over here. That winds up saying every 240 ticks we're going to destroy ice platforms, every 96 ticks we're going to go and bring ice, Q2 ice out, which you're going to see here. This is just dumping the ice that we actually wind up needing out of the cars. And then every 640 ticks we're going to destroy the rare, every 2400 ticks the epic, and every 4800 ticks the legendary. This is napkin math, kind of like going and creating the clocks here, but it's just one clock, and this is a very complicated clock that winds up just counting up to 9600, and then just emits all of the individual clocks themselves by basically, this is just, I didn't want to use a lot of combinators to go and create individual clocks, because then we need to run more heat pipes, so this was a way to consolidate them, so that the clock just kind of is modulo of each individual timer that we wind up wanting. So here's all those individual timers, right? So every 96 ticks, you're going to see this one wrap around, and then every 240 ticks, the ice platforms, etc. Those are then sent just to the filter inserters to pull the items out of the actual car, and then throw them into here to get voided. The benefit, again, of ice platforms is that they also consume ammonia, which you're creating in excess. That means that you can drastically reduce the amount of fluid voiding that you actually wind up doing here, because this is consuming then 770 of the amount that you'd have to normally void just for free, because it's just going to consume it anyway in here. So you gotta be a little bit more careful that you always still have some fluid in the system. So, which I just wind up just doing by just making sure that, you know, whenever we are, in this case, greater than 21,000 in the system, I wind up going and destroying it until we get below 17k. That's been a pretty decent amount here, so that these never get output blocked from specifically the fluid itself, but that also while keeping enough in the system so that the ice platforms can go and get recycled and get destroyed. I saw a pretty massive UPS improvement in terms of, now I don't know if it's better than, like, this particular setup is better than my old design, but I know that, like, the very first design that I ever created for this base, this particular design is 30% better in terms of UPS performance, so it's a pretty major improvement. So that's the core concept. So the idea is for each of these to produce 40 uncommon science per second, which you can pretty easily do, and then it just winds up filling up these cards. It slightly overproduces, and so it'll eventually get clogged up in here. But and when it does, I just wind up just setting the filters for the very infrequent items that we wind up having, and I left the rest unfiltered because it's slightly better for UPS to not set filters for some items in a car when for the most common items. So in this case, the most common is uncommon, and the rest are very infrequent, so I just keep a dedicated area for those so that it doesn't get completely clogged up with uncommon ice. And then it'll occasionally just stop. That all comes up, we still use the exact same setup that we had for producing lithium, and this winds up going into here where it actually picks up the lithium plates occasionally and goes and shoves them into these lithium cryogenic plants, and then ultimately these are all clocked to produce exactly the 40 per second that we wind up needing here, and brings them all on the belt. These are all picked up, these always double swing, ice and the actual lithium plates, and you'll see that here. And then ultimately, this is all one shared clock here that is going to then turn off completely whenever this gets over, I think it's 20,000 or so? Yeah, 20,000. Good memory. And then that shuts off all of these different blades. Because they're all going to be producing at the exact same rate, these are exactly clocked to 240 per second, even though this can produce slightly higher. So you'll see occasionally these will wind up actually running out of input materials, and that's on purpose. So in general, these are producing exactly 240, so each block is a 240 block. There is potentially a breakpoint if you get more actual beacons around here, although in testing I haven't found that to be any better. So you could effectively reduce the number of cryogenic plants you have if you go and create even more beacons around them. But you'd have to use cars, and I didn't want to deal with that complexity, so I kept the main core design the same, and then ultimately just changed the base. And I didn't see any net difference between those two in the testing that we did on our Discord channel. So, otherwise, some changes that are here is we've removed all the extra section for just making platforms, and now we have a very nice and much smaller overall Aquillo base. So we have a lot less heat that we have to run everywhere to all the pipes and all those kinds of things. So, let's talk about the wonderful quantum processor setup, because I think this is one of the coolest things that I've been involved with in designing so far. This is the new self-contained blade for making quantum processors. So, in the previous design I had a lot more rocket silos that are actually launching from here, but I've kind of found that, like, this is plenty for the amount of throughput that I wind up actually needing. This is significantly better than the previous designs. So this was heavily inspired by Klux's video that he came out with a couple weeks ago about how he's using cars to wind up actually buffering as a chest for holding the actual quantum processors. After that video, both Geist, myself, and Klux spent a little bit of time reworking the original setup. One of the things that I wanted to bring to the table was I wanted to go and introduce clocks for this, because one of the things you're going to notice here is that there's almost zero wake lists that are kind of active right now. And the main contributing factor to that is the way that we've actually belted the individual items in here. So let's first talk about this. This general layout was designed by Geist, and I really, really like this concept. So this is max beaconing the electromagnetic plants, and in this case it really makes sense to max beacon it, because this gets you up to 10 per second. And 10 is kind of a magic number, because you can get to the point where you are producing a full here of 110 per second. Now, this is overkill for my current scale with the amount of Promethium Science that I'm delivering. But it doesn't really matter, because it also gives you a lot of other really nice ratios here. So this gives you the ability to create 40 per second carbon, 80 per second lithium plates that you wind up needing. And it really conveniently allows me, in this particular case, to use the exact same setup that I have for producing lithium plates as I use over here on this blade. So you'll see that these are exactly the same, exact same clocks that are wind up being used to produce, in this case, 40 per second, to produce 120 per second of the cryogenic science that we wind up needing. And you can wind up having that exact same setup of 40 per second to produce also now all of the quantum chips that you wind up needing. So this particular setup of 11 of these is going to produce per second 110, consume 80 per second lithium plates. So with the exact same production setup as producing 240 of the uncommon science. So now just made for normal quality. So here, the way that this is working then is we effectively have all of the actual input materials are all belted in, and I have a little monitor here that just lets me know what are the individual items that are currently on the planet so that I know that I am 100% on all of them and I don't have any issues in terms of throughput or running out of individual materials. And one big difference is now, instead of having a ship that would fly around and craft all the parts in space, I bring the LDS and blue circuits from Fulgora. So I just have them launch occasionally, which we'll touch on in a second, along with also the uncommon, and all of these different parts are coming from Fulgora. Again, just one ship that's bringing all the parts around, which is this freight ship. So these are all belted in, so directly from the hub, and these now come into this individual actual setup here, and you can see they're all just belted in, split between the different sides. And this feeds then the rocket parts and then also the blue chips that we wind up needing here with a priority splitter that's just going to bring the blue chips to the actual production here for quantum processors. And ultimately then, right now you're seeing the whole entire setup is dormant. It's dormant when, in this case, this particular machine is not working and the quantum processors that are on the output are over a very specific number. So the number is, in this case, this is not working, and very simply, there is no request from space for quantum processors. So the only instance in which this would not be running is in the case that this chest here is completely full, and also there are no requests coming from space. So right now, you can see there's a request coming from space for the quantum processors. This goes, and you can see that we're requesting 16,000 quantum processors right now from space. So that little short circuit turns off, and then the inserters go and turn on again and start inserting. Now you're going to notice something here. You're going to notice that this inserter dumps first, and then you're going to start noticing that this inserter starts running. That's intentional because of the way that the inserter mechanics work here. So the insertion limits are incredibly low here. It's 12 for lithium plates because it's 2 times the amount that we need, and then it's only 6 for all the rest of them. So the way that this clock works is because of the size and like how high this can stack to, we're always going to pull 16 out exactly. But instead of trying to split between the 2 different sides, which is unstable by nature, getting it all the way to clock all the way up to holding 32 items is pretty hard to do. So pulling it out exactly 16 is a lot easier. So the way that this works then is this clock is split into 2 different parts. So half of it is split and it sends a single signal, which is the normal quality quantum, which is going to go down to the bottom here. When we then go to the next portion of this clock that wraps around, we're going to go to the 1057 all the way up to like 3000 something, or 2000 in this case. Then we're going to send the uncommon signal. The uncommon signal goes up here to this top inserter, so it turns on and then grabs items out of it. And so this helps a lot because the 175% prod that's on here is kind of a pain to kind of deal with. And because it's going to produce items in kind of like an off ratio. So instead of letting it wait all the way until you stack up to 32, and then having both of them unload, we just split the difference and do one side and then the other side. In practice, this works out really good, and allows then one chest to continue to get filled up, and then the other chest to also then just later on get produced and fill up as well. So that's kind of how these clocks work. This was created with the clock generator. Just again, just a point, if you missed in the last video, there's a mod now where you can use to use this to find all of the different inserters, where they're pulling from, what the crafting speed is, and extract all that and dump it into the actual clock generator website. Otherwise, the clocking is what I contributed to it. The general layout that you're seeing here is created by Geist. And then ultimately where this all came from is actually the car concept comes from Klux, and I'll link his YouTube channel down below as well. This is a pretty cool design that is now finally using stack inserters for everything. And you'll notice that lithium is on both sides of the belt. So just like I talked about in the last video with utility science and how it's beneficial to double insert from both sides the item that is 2x the rest of them, this is using that same concept. However, this concept is also brittle by nature because these inserters could get stuck. So when you kick this off for the very first time, it's really important to wait until all the belts are saturated before starting it. And this is also included in my blueprint book, so you can go and you can check this out if you want to use this exact same design in your base. But as long as effectively you always have back pressure of holmium plates and you're constantly producing the lithium plates, you should, in theory, never get into a situation where this system gets unstable. If it ever does, you'll have to remove all the inserters and the actual quantum processors. But I've been running this for a very long time. This has produced it has produced 6 million quantum processors, and I've never had a problem with instability. So I think you're good. Just like I said, just be mindful of that you want to just make sure that you constantly have production of lithium plates. Or rather, sorry, holmium plates, so that you can make the lithium plates that you wind up needing. So speaking of holmium, how do we create all the holmium that we're going to need for this particular design here, right? Well, let's go touch on Fulgora for a little bit. So in a previous video, I talked about how I switched over to Klux's train designs for Fulgora, and it drastically improved the overall UPS of my base by probably about 11% across the entire base, which is huge. So I have not redesigned Fulgora. I am straight up using exactly the designs that Klux came up with in his base. So you'll see those here. This is this train voiding design. I found this is like so much better than the recyclers themselves. So I said, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to borrow from, to use the quote that good artists copy and then great artists steal. So straight up have stolen the design that Klux has created, as it works phenomenally for this specific use case. So for crafting Q2 science here on Fulgora, I am straight up using those, and it has drastically improved the UPS of my base, both running worker robot speed and also for running research productivity. So if you haven't checked out Klux, go check out his YouTube channel. I'll have it as a link in the video description. Super awesome design here. This is really interesting, to say the least, that this works so much better than actually going and destroying all of the excess materials that you make when you're making Q2. Now, the benefit of this is that it is slightly it's going to be slightly holmium positive. So with this setup, actually, the nice thing is that there's a general export here for upcycling the extra holmium plates that we wind up needing, and then those just go into this chest here that produces the excess holmium that we wind up needing, and it goes into this chest. This is then isolated. Now, again, this is, if you want a more in-depth video about how this works, I'll talk, I would definitely go and link Klux's channel where he talked about it for the first time, but I'm using this as a general export now for the blue chips that we wind up needing, so those are then exported here, and then also the LDS, and there's a very small amount of 50 logistics bots that are in this network to just supply these extra rocket silos so that you can go and export occasionally when needed the extra amounts of blue and LDS for ultimately to feed Aquillo. Now, it also then exports the very small amount of holmium plates that we wind up needing, so the uncommon plates, and so this build ultimately handles both use cases, and that's why it's so much better in producing all of the materials that you need for Aquillo, compared to the isolated build that I had, which was an uncommon upcycler. This can handle both of them. This leads me to the final piece of the puzzle, the actual Promethium production. So, I spent some time making these ships ultimately better. Introduced clocking where necessary, where appropriate, clocking also all of the nice asteroid collectors, and I've made these individual ships as good as I possibly can for now. So, one of the things that I wanted to eliminate was sushi belts, so in the previous the previous video where I talked about how I'm producing the individual parts for rocket fuel and those kinds of things, one of the key changes that I wanted to make was having a very stable PWM control for actually how fast these are going to be running when they're in half speed. So let's go and find one. So this one's in full speed. Let's go and look for one that is currently running at half speed. So this little indicator tells me that I'm running at full speed or a slower speed when I'm harvesting. So here's throttled speed. One of the things that you notice here is that I'm very, very tightly keeping this at 500 kilometers a second as much as I can, because I wanted this to be running as smooth as possible. One of the problems that I had with the ships in the past is that this would oscillate pretty heavily and like plus or minus 20 kilometers per second. So in controlling tuning specifically the little very simple latching mechanism that I have for turning on and off and pulsing these and choking the actual restricted like flow of this, I've been able to get this to almost exactly 500 kilometers per second. So in theory, we could actually do this by turning on and off and clocking the advanced thruster fuel itself, or the actual chem plants, which would be better. I had a hard time getting that to be stable, so for right now, I'm wind up just using pumps, and it's not as optimal as it could be, but when I actually go and finally get to the point of redesigning and creating a brand new ship, that'll be something that I will be experimenting with, is getting the ability to actually clock the chemical plants instead of relying on the actual pumps here that are needed. So this now runs at a very smooth 500 kilometers per second once we get out far enough into the actual field, and then it will speed up to once we get to the point where we're not saturated anymore with the Promethium chunks that we wind up needing. So the changes here is I don't use sushi belts anymore. Again, I'm using that concept that I talked about in the last video about kind of having a non-moving belt and just topping them up when needed. So this is plenty, just having one dedicated of the asteroid collectors for the individual parts that we need. And here we don't need to reprocess anything at all because we are going to always be traveling out into a very dense asteroid area that's going to have just a constant surplus of oxide of like every single individual component that we're going to wind up needing. So again, this uses this concept of, in here there's absolutely no need for circuit control because I'm just using balancers and this not balancers, but just clever belt routing, and then also prioritizing the inside lane here, and the inside lane of course is coming from the advanced oxide asteroid crushing, right? So there's no need then to recycle or balance the actual ice. Just occasionally we wind up, when we run out of excess, we just throw it off the ship. So very, very occasionally we'll throw something off and this will get dumped then into space. So ultimately, one of the main changes that I've made is the railgun ammo production is using a heavily direct insertion build. I've kind of clocked this, but really the problem with a railgun ammo specifically is because it stacks up to 10. You can't actually pull 16 out of it. So for that reason, what I just do is, hey, whenever this is greater than 4, go and emit a signal so that this goes and picks up 4 items. And then once it gets up to 16, it can go, and in this case, it gets up to 8, it can go and drop them. So that is what's ultimately happening inside here. You'll see this stack up to 4 or 5, and then this will go and pick it up. And because it's stacking up to 10, it can't fully pick up 16. So it just goes and drops it when it gets to 8 naturally anyway. So that's how this setup works. This then will shut down whenever this gets too full, and we'll ultimately keep on just using lead follower for this, and pretty simply. The rockets has been completely redesigned, where now I have, again, a clock here that is going to turn on and off so that we are having a double swing input of the actual explosives, and then the actual rockets is a single swing so that they come in here. So, again, just belt driven. Not absolutely optimal, but then they wind up coming in and getting routed up here. So I just wind up just checking, hey, whenever this is greater than 600, shut down the build and make sure that this clock can wrap all the way around to the very starting position, and only then shut it down. That way you have effectively all the machines are all in the same state. This is nice because you're going to have different amounts of load over time on all of these individual rockets and how much you're actually consuming, and so instead of having a fixed clock that produces all the time, we just shut them down whenever this belt has too much on it. So, and that's just a way to always produce at the same fixed rate, but allow also this to be dynamic in terms of shutting down when the belt has too many items on it. This is now all clocked. One of the things that I've changed is instead of using max productivity, because if you go for absolutely max a prod here, you're going to have way too much carbon. And so what this system is doing here is this can go and destroy any excess that we wind up producing of carbon. It's still slightly positive, but this allows us to always have constant back pressure. If you don't do this, I've kind of noticed that if you do all speed beacons, it's actually the perfect ratio, but then you'll occasionally lose out on back pressure here on the carbon, and that's kind of annoying. When that happens, then so what I've done is I've just kind of like a balancing act. I use one productivity module so that we can have always constant back pressure here, but ultimately then just recycling the slight amount of excess that we wind up getting here. I know I say slight, this has destroyed 18 million of them, but it is slight because, like, in terms of like production here, this has produced 9 million of them and is consumed, at ratio here 5 times that amount. So it means like 40 million of them have actually been consumed over time that this is actually consumed compared to the 20 million that we're destroying here. So 80 million across these two, right? So I'm destroying a small amount, and the reason I'm actually putting in recyclers is because there's a UPS cost of throwing stuff off the ship. So I try to minimize that as much as I possibly can. And so in that case, the recyclers in my mind, in theory, is going to be better than throwing it off the ship. So just when they occasionally happen to need to be run. So just using a priority splitter here, that's going to just bring the items in when needed. And then when it happens to occasionally back up, it'll just destroy it. So again, just using dedicated asteroid collectors to bring the items in, and this has just a circuit that winds up saying, hey, we can fit 60 items in here, and then to shut off the whole entire system, stop collecting anything, fully shut down this decider combinator. Whenever it gets then below 40, we'll go and pick things up again until we get over 60, which means this is almost barely active. I don't clock this at all. I find it's just like easier to just turn it on and turn it off occasionally when necessary, and that's enough for actually just using just like a very simple latch here to turn this on and turn this off. This sets then the filters and enables it when there's a check mark, and so this just will occasionally say, hey, you're under 40, go and grab the items and fill it up again. You can see just how quickly this very quickly will fill up completely again when actually needed. So it's dynamic, just based on the consumption rate here. And then again, goes around with my concept of having a inside lane that's always stopped, so they always have something to pick up on, but also the outside lane is then prioritized to come around again. And so this is very simply just designed to go and top off the belt whenever we're less than 70, and then we'll just fill it up. So these occasionally will just fill up items, and that's how this whole system works. It's a lot better than just constant moving sushi. Otherwise, yeah, we're using red ammo now. I used to be using lasers, which was just substantially worse. I'm very close to researching the point of physical projectile damage. If I get one more level, I'm able to two-shot the very large Promethium asteroids. So if we go to one that's like actually out into the field, we'll look at one of these. So the medium asteroids have 800 health, which is higher than all the other ones. So the break point here is if I get to the point where I can actually deliver 400 plus damage. So right now this is producing 430 physical damage, or 438. I'm going to need slightly more to overcome the 10% resistance that those individual chunks have here to physical damage. And so once we get one more level of physical projectile damage, we will see a pretty major drop-off on the actual piercing rounds. Because right now, when these get destroyed, they get destroyed, and let me find one of these. When they actually get shot down by one of these here, they need a third shot to finish them off, and they are left with maybe 5 health or 8 health or something like that. But it does mean we have one extra shot that's happening occasionally when we actually do fire them. So once we get to that point, then we can actually have less of these turrets, which would be an overall net positive for UPS. And I understand that I'm getting to the point in my actual base where no one will want to actually use my Promethium ship because the tech requirements are going to be in the 134 billion science level. But that's kind of like where I'm going because I've already invested the time in this base to research to that point, so I might as well start designing things based on the tech level that I have. So that's currently the concept. Now, that all being said, one big change that I want to talk about for Research Prod is these Promethium ships are inherently suffering from a problem that is due to just the sheer tininess of them. All this extra asteroids that are here on the sides of the ship, And we'll let the frames buffer a little bit so that I can actually go and talk about this a little bit better. Poor graphics card. So one of the things that are here on the side is these extra, just because we are doing thruster stacking, you're going to have all these extra asteroids here. If I doubled the ship and didn't increase the height of this, we would still have the same number of asteroids here on the side. So in essence, one of the things that would benefit me substantially is just doubling the width of my ship and then keeping the same thruster stacking. Because like we can get significantly more throughput. Now the problem is I'm limited here because I am directly belting all of just 4 of these Promethium Science packs. So this caps out at about 20k per minute. That's why I'm running 6 of these ships. So, did I just lose a ship? Oh, no, thank God. Okay, I just haven't marked it on the side. Oof, that scared me for a second. I'm looking currently at 3. You go and mark that in that so that I have it. By the way, if you pin these, one of the nice things you can do is you can edit kind of the distance of how far you want to have them, and you can turn them off from being always visible. That way you can kind of hover over them and see what they're currently doing, and then you can also change your preview distance. So if you want to just see the whole ship as a whole when it's running, you can do that, or you can change kind of your ability here. So, alright, did the visibility thing. The problem here is that I am throughput limited substantially. I can definitely collect a lot more asteroids than I currently have. So you'll see here that this will occasionally back up in the buffer in terms of how much is it actually collecting. And the further out you are, you'll wind up noticing this quite a bit. This is constantly backed up. So I am right now limited by the speed of the belts. So I really do need a new design that instead of directly inserting into the hub here, what I would want to be doing is belting the actual Promethium and also belting all the eggs. That's going to be ultimately better, and then we're going to have, we can drastically increase the width of these ships and then maximize or minimize the amount of update time that's being lost by just these happening to just be floating across the sides. Because if you think about it, that whole entire width of the ships here, of those extra asteroids that are flying along here, is going to be, right now, for all of these, is extra just wasted UPS of just these asteroids here. And you know that because if we go and show the entity time usage, you'll see that right now asteroids are pretty high. It's 1.2 ms of update time. And a lot of that is just the asteroids that happen to be floating along the sides of the ship. So making the ship substantially wider is going to be ultimately a better usage for me, and going away from these small runners that I have. They're cool. This is probably the best that I can make these small little quad designs. And I don't think I can optimize these anymore because I have done my absolute best to get the speed exactly right, to minimize the amount of width and the amount of tonnage so that we can get faster ships moving and all those things. And completely going to the point where we are just using gun turrets and occasionally just a laser for the big Promethium asteroid ships that potentially can come across, because they have 100% physical damage multiplier, so the physical just does almost basically nothing to them, and you do need to use lasers to destroy them. Opted for that, and then also even using, that's why you're seeing here that I'm using rare laser turrets, and I'm using legendary gun turrets. And the reason is because of the overlap in terms of their range here. So you can see here kind of how they are almost identical. And so that's so that when I'm looking at the turret coverage, it's equal across both of them. So I'm only just sniping them when they happen to come and potentially could hit one of these. And that's just for damage control. So Promethium is cool, and it's nice that I have these tiny little ships, and I really appreciate that I can see the entire thing in the viewfinder here. But realistically, this is going to have to be probably 3 times as wide, is probably where I'm going to start targeting for this, because this small size, and I'd much rather go down to just 2 ships compared to 6 ships if I can. And so if I'm going to be doing that, I'm going to need to increase the width 3-fold to have the same collection and all that. So I will eventually dive down into a rabbit hole of doing that. But I think that's the biggest amount of UPS loss that I have, is because of the strategy that I'm employing with running 6 of these small running ships. It's super stable, not having a single problem in terms of Promethium production here. We are able to now normalize, and like I've talked about in previous videos about spacing out your Promethium ships. and at least specifically in the last one, you can see now that we are producing exactly 115, 200, and you see this like up kind of like pattern of them running all the time very consistently because of that very even like spacing that happens. And so you see here over the last like 2 hours that I've been running Promethium Science, you can wind up seeing now that we are like stable at 115K that we're consuming and producing. And so talking about spacing, you'll see that these are perfectly spaced out to be 6 minutes apart so that they are at different areas of their actual run. So you have always one coming back, one that's currently over Novice, one that's going to be going and picking up Aquillos, like stuff from Aquillo, etc. An interesting pattern that also kind of gets created is if we look at quantum processors, you'll see that I am at 2x the actual amount that I have. And the reason is because ultimately I want to 2x the space. I still want to get to that point because I think the theoretical limit of where you can actually get to is going to be at the like about 5 million science per minute. Which, if I run any other science, I'm in the 180 to 200 UPS right now. So everything else, every other science other than Promethium, is exceptionally able to be and is ready to be scaled up. The only problem that I have right now is I just can't get over the limitation that I have, and it's purely based on these Promethium Science chips that I'm running. So what I wanted to say was here, you can see that kind of this. If you're looking at this, the interesting part is how the quantum processors get created and then have a huge amount of downtime, and then they wait for the next ship to come as well. That's also a nice thing about spreading out your Promethium chips, is that your delivery of the actual parts that you're going to wind up needing for production of quantum processors is going to be also evenly distributed. That means that you have, like everywhere else, if we're looking at the actual plates that we're producing over here, so if I look at, what is this called again, tungsten carbide? You can see that also the tungsten itself, these are going to be evenly distributed in terms of when they're going to be created. So they're going to have like a much more smooth kind of production of when we're actually going to need them, rather than being a large spike of all of them needing to be created at the same time. So that's where it's a huge function of the core kind of clock of your entire base. It comes down to how you wind up evenly distributing and creating a inner delay between those ships. So that's incredibly important. And it's also important because then that means that you always have a ship that's arriving over Novice and you're not running out of Promethium Science. It also means you don't need as large of a Promethium buffer. The one nice thing that I will say about having this number of ships is that I only need to buffer 2 million Promethium Science packs in here, or 2.5 million. If I increase the size, or if I decrease the number of ships, I'm going to have to buffer 4 million Promethium Science packs in here. So that's just like a downside as well, and this is where this all is a balancing act, right? Of that, you're going to need to buffer more in the hub if you have less ships, and that's just because they're going to not always have one over Novice, because there's going to be slight periods where it's not there. So in this case, this ship just arrived, it dumps almost all of its Promethium Science, and in essence, now we're at a point where if I wind up having less ships, I'm going to have to change how I space things out, and I'm going to have to increase the buffers so that, because this would be coming back with, instead of 776,000 Promethium Science packs, it would be coming back with 1 million, 2 million, right, that it would have in one trip. So you would just need to buffer more on Novice and hold it while they're traveling back and forth. So, one other benefit I talked about in the last video, but because I've eliminated the token system, is that it's completely removed the delay of when I actually can launch rockets or launch all of the actual eggs up. So, like, immediately, this can actually go and launch all of the eggs, and there's no delay anymore with, like, the handoff of bringing the extra token, which was that epic barrel that I was bringing back and filling with, and then launching it specifically to say, hey, you can go and send something. This means that there is no inherent delay, and the only thing is an artificial one, which is my clock here that I'm setting. So the only delay in the whole system is this. So waiting until we can actually launch all of the eggs. That's a conclusion of this three-part mini-series talking about how I've scaled up my base to be able to hit well over the million ESPM challenge that Kovarex issued back when Space Age first came out. This is definitely not the end, and there is a lot more headroom that we can go and continue to play with. For now, this is about as far as I'm pushing research productivity for this short section of time. But I wanted to go and take the time to actually be able to have a well-balanced base and truly hit the target that I wanted to hit, which was getting to the point where I can run all the labs flat out, straight up, over 60 UPS with both research prod and with the all the other sciences. So since we've achieved that now, this has been a goal of mine for quite a while. Now, the only question then is, what's next? So the next thing is, I need to continue on with a lot of these competitions that I've had to continue to figure out, are the quality sciences better or worse than their common variants? So right now, I think I can, if I had to kind of talk about this as a nutshell here, Vulcanus is kind of a question of if it is actually better for UPS or not. The big benefit of all these sciences coming from these outer planets here, so Aquillo, Fulgora, Vulcanus, Gleba, is that the uncommon variants are going to reduce by half the bot usage on Novice. It also reduces by half the amount of actual ships that you wind up needing to travel back and forth, and you can see here that I only wind up using one ship per planet, except for Gleba, because Gleba is its own special thing. So that's a huge benefit. Right now, I can I can immediately say Aquillo is going to be better in Q2. You should just run Q2 Science, and with that, you want to pair it with a Q2 variant on Fulgora. With the train voiding mechanism that we've seen by Klux, and then also with a lot of the improvements that I've made here on Q2 with Aquillo, I'm very confident that these two are at least Q2 in terms of their efficacy of going for quality science. Vulcanus is kind of still a question, which I'll need to test more in depth when we actually get to that point. Gleba, without a doubt, is always going to be common, and also Promethium Science is always going to be common. Right now, the ones that I know don't really make a difference is red, green, and blue on Novice. You can do one or the other, and it doesn't make a huge difference for my testing, so you can kind of choose your own battle there. I'll probably retest that once I get to increasing the scale of my base and noticing if I make a difference there. But the other thing, though, is now the unknowns for me are purple science, gray science or black science, so military, and utility science, so yellow. Are those going to be better in uncommon and voiding and stone and ore and all that kind of stuff? So that's the next goal for me, is to go back to Novice, keep on doing the competition series that I've been hosting, get back to purple science, figure out what's going to be better, and ultimately figure out how we can continue to optimize Novice as much as we can. And Novice is going to be the main place that we hang out at, because it's half the sciences are produced there out of all the 12, right? So this has been a really fun exploration for me to kind of get to the point where I can continue to do this. So I appreciate all of the comments on the videos. I read almost every single one that I can, and I'll respond when I can to it as well. And appreciate just in general the interest that a lot of these videos have, and people's responses to them. It really motivates me to continue to work on this base and continue to make it better. And we'll see what the future holds in terms of how far we can continue to push science. So, as always, the factory must grow. My name is Nasty. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next video.